anti-nuclear, I'm doing feminism, I'm doing Māori Land March, I'm doing Waitangi, I'm doing what happened. Did that all flowed through into the 80s, and we have Springbok, and then we have what happened with the Labour government and the economics and the resurgence of, and the continuation of the nuclear free that actually sat on the class war that was going on and the understanding of the change of economics, and it sat on Māori aspirations as well, and it took up, because for me that's a thing, but it might, and so now we have to face the 2000s, and I suspect that's going to be our hardest bit.
I would like to interpose just a minute. There's one thing that is so glaringly obvious that we haven't mentioned at all, but it goes all the way through from 1945 to 2025 in the New Zealand movement, and that's international solidarity.
Yes, absolutely.
And that covers Corso, that covers the Vietnam War movement, that covers the apartheid South Africa movement, that covers East Timor, it covers Chile, and right now it covers Gaza.
Yeah.
All the way through, international solidarity.
There is a big gap, I think, in international solidarity groups. One of the things that Corso did was propagate international solidarity groups like babies. Every 9 months there was a new one. Nicaragua, Kanaki, Tahiti, East Timor, West Papua, you name it, there was a solidarity group, Philippines. For it, and one of the things I think from the 2000s on is we stopped having international visitors in the same way. We stopped having those strong solidarity links where we explained what each other, and then we printed the stories or we published the stories from those international solidarity groups, so movements knew what was going on. That was quite a change, but yeah, I agree, it's a big thing. Okay, so 2000s. Who'd like to start? I got expelled from Corso, spent a year occupying the building and then sulked for a while, so I don't think it should be me.
For me, it was more of the same. But I mean, one of the highlights of the 2000s, I worked for two groups, Kafka and the Anti-Basis Campaign, was 2008, the Dome Busters. You know, actually people attacking, non-violently, New Zealand's premier spy base, one of the most important bloody outfits in the world, and getting away with it, and being acquitted. I went to the trial in Wellington and organised a week of activity in Wellington from Christchurch to go with that. And I mean, that was completely, that created uproar throughout the country, that these scruffy looking bastards, a priest, a bloody subsistence farmer and some sort of other character who looked like came from Footrot Flats, had gone in and with a sickle had actually slashed these bloody domes and had to wait 30 minutes to get arrested while the security guard was smoking dope or sleeping inside. And they went to court in Wellington, were charged, and came up with a defence that was so good and so novel that a jury acquitted them in 2010, so the Key government changed the law so that nobody could ever mount that defence again. And then they sued them for $1 million to try to get the money back for putting the dome up. They sued them for every cup of coffee and every pizza, and they said, well, okay, go it for the money, we haven't got any, because we're poor Catholic workers. And so the government got so embarrassed, and also that would mean the spies would have had to testify in court. And so, yes, that was one of the highlights of the 2000s for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually we should just mention our own SAS story, when Get Watchdog was spied on through the 90s, which culminated in David finding the SIS in Aziz Chowdhury's house during a conference we'd organised, Trading with Our Lives. And we clearly that night labelled the fact that the state had been caught in the house. Anyway, there's a long, we won't bore everybody with the story, but that culminated in a series of court cases, and in 1999 a settlement with Aziz, and it was found within the High Court that every time the SIS had been in someone's house, it was illegal. They never had the right to actually invade anybody's private property space. And so they accepted they'd made them that Aziz had a case and that he won that case, but then they retrospectively changed the law so no one else could do that. So it took out all those other people who had been spied on, couldn't actually take a case against them. And through the 90s, one of the things that we had fought quite hard was a changing security environment and harsher security laws which targeted economic activism, environmental activism, Māori activism much more strongly throughout that time. And it's one of those things that led, I think, to the state agencies having no idea what was going on with the right wing when the mosque shooting happens, because they're so busy looking at the left, because they've got used to it through the 70s, 80s and 90s. But being caught, that was the first time that it clearly happened in that way, and the case was significant. And then you lead to into the 2000s.
The end of the 2000s, the SIS had their glasnost or perestroika moment, or whatever you want to call it, and started releasing files.
Might not be a thing for other people. So I flow through the decades, and I'm just wondering how other people flow through. What are their links? You don't get to the beginning of the 2000s. We've got 2001, and the World Trade Center comes down, and a whole range of things happen. The anti-war movement fires up, and the Iraq War, which hadn't been since the 90s. So we've got Iraq and Afghanistan. We've got a kind of polarised society where many people are completely on America's side, but we're quite a strong push in left movements and understanding that actually what the states were going to do was going to be dreadful and terrible, and nobody believed in the weapons of mass destruction. So there's a real kind of polarisation there, I thought, in the beginning around people who didn't actually care about the World Trade Center, but were really worried about what the US was going to do in the Middle East, and people who were completely on the US side.
It was a very strong anti-war movement in New Zealand against the Iraq War.
It was.
Around the world, like 1 million people marched in London and Rome. But also New Zealand, there were big movement. 03, and once again, it was a classic single-issue movement. That when that war petered out, or appeared to peter out, so that movement went. And that's the story of the New Zealand progressive movement.
But there was, I think, some depth in the peace movement argument there, and it didn't, I don't know where it went, because there was more understanding that there were big global issues at play. This wasn't just, couldn't just be an anti-war movement. It had to have a bigger framework, and so there were lots of arguments within that movement that I thought were a bit heartening, because at least there was an understanding it was a bigger framework to be talking about.
The beginning of where outrage didn't work.
Yeah,
that's been the main theme for me of this, that outrage, they don't take any notice of it.
But we're still doing it.
They're still doing it, but they don't take any notice, and they get away with it. It just doesn't work anymore.
Is that the 2000s?
Yeah, I think you're right about that.
It was Iraq, wasn't it?
Yeah,
it
it's
was.
Iraq.
I mean, from there on, it just doesn't work.
The beginning of the time, the outrage doesn't work.
Yeah.
Because we see that in Gaza really clearly now, but actually I think Paul's right. Iraq is the beginning of that.
Millions of people on the streets, and
They shrugged their shoulders and went on ahead with their lies and their deceit, which we all knew were lies and
Well, it was a
deceit, but they
managed
didn't
war.
care.
I talked about Vietnam being the first televised war. But Iraq, and starting actually with the British on the Falkland Islands in the 80s, it was a war where the media were controlled. So they allowed embedded journalists to go with them and push that message. And so you got one story, the official story about that war. And in those days, the Christchurch Press was owned by Rupert Murdoch. And so they were running front page stories in the Christchurch Press about sort of evil weapons of mass destruction and germ warfare and all that sort of stuff about Iraq in the Christchurch paper.
And so it's also the beginning of our understanding of the high level of misinformation and outright deceit
And lies.
that comes from the state.
and
Yeah.
that whole
Yeah.
People realise that
Yeah,
now. I mean,
absolutely.
that's generally realised, and that feeds into all sorts of other unpredictable areas, like stuff about vaccines, and that you're lying to us. Well, why should we believe what you say, the official state, because you lied about this other stuff?
Because they do lie about things all the time.
And I think it's also the whole echo chamber.
The whole what? Oh,
Echo chamber phenomenon of where people are just, watching what they want to watch.
You get the role of social media.
So
So
they stay within their own belief system and can find other people.
That probably came a little bit later, I think.
And the algorithms work to feed it and stuff, and so the whole
it's developed the
political
Caroline
narcissism
basically
really begins to happen.
the sort of
There's no before. Everyone, I suppose, watch the news, you might get different viewpoints, because you all read the paper, but suddenly you're just seeing what you want to see, and hearing what you want to see, hearing what you want to hear, and there's a sort of dialogue starts disappearing really.
So the opening of huge amounts of information, but the narrowing of information that you get.
Narrowing of focus.
Yeah, narrowing of focus.
Huge amounts, but narrow of focus.
It's fragmentation of media, social media, and the thing I'm thinking about is remember during lockdown 2020 when nobody was allowed to gather, there was a big Black Lives Matter protest throughout the country, a big one in Wellington, thousands of people, and it was gone. I've never heard of it again. Has anybody here heard of Black Lives Matter protests again?
Well, that's the difficulty of imported models, and we see that through the 2000s with Occupy too, where and that's again the kind of internet activism that was rising, is that you then import a model whole into your context without a real thought about what your context is and how that will work. And Occupy made sense on Wall Street, but it made zero sense in Aotea Square or in Wellington. Or Hagley Park, but it gained a lot of people because it looked so good overseas, and then it was wholly disappointing. It was like going on a Tinder date and finding they'd given you a different picture. It was nothing like what they'd been doing in the US, and it wasn't something we could do, but that model of importing whole protest action and ideas became very strong, I thought, in the 2000s. And so we didn't have our own ideas, but also we weren't doing solidarity with other campaigns and other organising, because we didn't talk to them. We just watched them and then did what they did. And that's not solidarity. I don't know what that is. What's that?
Imitation. So that's the 2000, you're talking about Occupy. Occupy was 2011, if I recall.
Yeah.
2011. I mean, the things about, if we went into that next decade?
Well, no, let's still, because we've kind of missed the middle, I think, and I'm trying to, is it because I can't think, or because I wasn't?
What year was the Hikoi? I think it was the 90s or something.
And Hikoi was the 90s.
Because that was a
Fourth
kind
floor
of
of
vaguely
Sydney by
grasped. It was
1994.
set up about the Anglicans.
When the Maori Party started, grew out of the Hikoi.
No, that's 2007 is the Foreshore and Seabed Hikoi, and so you get up to 2007,
I'm trying to work out when the genuine protests were.
not much happened.
Two Hoi raids.
But in 2007, you've got massive Foreshore and Seabed protest, and that felt, from my perspective, I felt like the 2000s people didn't know what to do, and very little was actually happening, and much of what had happened fragmented into nothingness. But that 2007 Hikoi was mammoth. Was it 2007, 2005? I'm not good at dates. Anyway, it was mammoth, and people clearly understood the grab of Māori resources from the state, and it did activate a whole range of thinking and wanting to be involved again that hadn't existed
Of course,
before.
what I just said was the raids.
Yeah, and then you've got the 2008
You know what we're talking
Tuhoi
about?
raids.
You know what we're talking about? Okay, 2007, the state raided activists up and down the country, armed cops, right? They grabbed people in Wellington, old Valerie and co, Bay of Plenty. I went to Francie's place.
Yeah,
She told me to fuck
Francis'
off because there was never warrant.
No, she called me and I told her to
Oh,
fuck
okay.
off.
But they raided Tuhoi country in the Oroweras. There's a whole movie about it called Operation H. Was another movie actually, and I mean bailed up school kids and buses with guns and all that sort of stuff. And people like Tamiiti, there was a trial, and the whites they were charged with organising armed struggle. This
Well,
was
they were charged under the terrorism
charged under the Terrorism Act.
originally, but then those charges were withdrawn, and they were all charged under the Crimes Act
And the firearms.
and the Firearms Act. And Tami went to jail for charges under the
Mary went to
Firearms Act.
Yeah.
Tami and
Someone else.
that's terrible. I can't remember his name.
Kruger?
No.
And the others who'd spent quite long remand periods in jail were found not guilty. But the purpose of the raids was that they were saying that Māori were organising armed struggle against the state, and they were doing that in the back blocks of Tuhoi, organised by Tami, and there were some Pākehā activists engaged in that as well. But they raided the they raided the community of Ruatoki and terrorised the children because they did it at kind of 5 in the morning. And yeah, I mean, it was huge. And in the end, the police commissioner apologised
In person.
but it was far too late. And it was the fear of a Helen Clark government. It was a Labour-led government. That Apiti Māori might be up to no good, and that they might be so angry about the foreshore and seabed that struggle was the next step. And there was a whole lot of bullshit around all of that. It's a very long story, and different people will tell you different things about it. But it was a huge, because it shocked people greatly.
There are lots of marches about it. I remember going marches and crossings about it.
If I can, a good way to look at the 2000s might be asking your stories. So what, if this works out, what were all of you folks up to in the 2000s?
What were who?
All of us up to in the 2000s.
You folks.
Well, I was doing what I do now, and so I was paid organiser for Campaign Against Foreign Control of Aotearoa and Anti-Fascist Campaign, and we organised in the 2000s. ABC organised a protest virtually every year at the Waihobo Spy Base. We organised a speaking tour by a former Canadian spy called Mike Frost. We organised a Filipino anti-racist activist called Cora Favaros to come out here in 2008, and we did a tour of Wellington, tour of secret Wellington, and we went to the Tangamoana spy base, the one that's not really in the publicity, in the lower North Island. And that was in 2005. So, yeah, and Kafka just choked along with the usual things that Kafka does.
But how successful do you think you were in that decade?
ABC stuff, as successful as we've been in any other decade in the sense that in relation to the Waihopai stuff. At a minimum, by going there, which we haven't done for a couple of years now, it was making the world at large think, oh yeah, that place is there. In terms of Kafka, it's a cumulative thing. I told you, I mean, coming over in the car, I did a TV interview a couple of weeks ago. Now, I haven't put out press releases in several years, but they wanted someone to react to Christopher Luxon's bloody statement about attracting foreign investment in his State of the Nation address, so they rang me up.
Well, we shifted down to Blackpool.
Yeah.
So, it's a very different sort of work, really, which was establishing a museum there, which, because it's got a basic story of trade unions, of workers giving a political voice, you know, that whole story from 1894 through to 1935, the establishing of a workers' voice in New Zealand political scene. And there's a strike that happened in Blackpool, which was sort of narco-syndicalist driven, the industrial workers of the world. So we got a museum which tells that story, basically, and does other exhibitions as well, on topics of, what was the last one about? It's called The Empire Strikes Back, and we looked at Palestine and Cuba, just if you challenge the empire, it has its revenge, and it's quite vicious revenge, you know, so we just told those. So it's exhibitions like that, but I suppose what it meant was that this village, just the story of the working class that's like pertinent to that village is out there to anyone. And that's, I remember an Aussie Union choir coming in and singing there, and they said, wouldn't it be good if every town, like it has its Anzac memorial, it actually had something which told the workers' contribution to that particular town region. That would be a change in hegemony, wouldn't it, if that happened? So that's you know, that's been a good thing to do, I think. It's we've theatrically we're telling local stories on local issues. Over a decade, about 10 a play a year, just looking at you know, the Maori story of that particular area. Do you know the
Also,
colonisation story? looking at transition economy, looking at solid energy when it collapsed. We told that story. Dairying, we had a play about dairying, had a play about 1080. So we do an issue which affected that community each year. And that was a good thing to do. The really interesting one was the transition economy, where we looked at all the possibilities in the play and then interviewed the audience afterwards to say what was acceptable to them, and it was quite fascinating that most of those things were acceptable. You know, they were just progressive stuff, wasn't it? We got sort of contact with the Cuban ambassadors and back to Cuba and as periodistas, and sort of formed a relationship with Cuba, which was quite nice, you know. I went back to university at the PhD just to write up the story of the theatre week. So that was sort of working back in the community really. And I suppose we've ended up realising though that of the local class, the local power block in the community like the coast, being able to identify it quite clearly. They exist everywhere, of course, but in a community that size you can see it family by family and person by person, and who's running the council and so on. And the since I've realised they don't listen, you know, that even they, you know them and you can talk to them, but they're not going to listen because that's the nature of power, you know.
It's not in their interest.
Yeah, so you know, we're having quite a good dialogue, but they're not going to listen ultimately. And that's interesting, and also the role you play with locals. I mean, a lot of them are quite conservative people and don't have a great consciousness, but it's interesting the sort of role, the place you have in a community like that with those people, because you're rubbing shoulders with them all the time. You know, you're not in your own church. I mean, shifting in there, I realised that a lot of activism, city activism, was actually you're in your own church. It's the same people going to demos and going to meetings, and you know, I mean, that's always that group of people, and in the same way as people go to church every Sunday because it reinforces the faith. You know, so that was a funny realisation living down there. And watching some crazy shit happen. I mean, Kim.com stuff. I mean, the Mana Party.com. You'd go, these people are absolutely crazy. You know? So yeah, and probably you'd find the Zapatistas fascinating because of what they're doing. It's a community movement. You could go, yeah, you know, I mean, in terms of and something like the museum, we've never been reliant on funding from any of the official funders because it's a bit fatal. But yeah, I mean, realising the limitations as well of you know, how far a community will go, how much they're interested in stuff they're not interested. You know, private capitalism is a very strong controller of people. A small community, you can see things more clearly, I suppose. That's the only advantage. There's disadvantages, of course, but you can see things very clearly, and that control of private capital is, and you know, the creating of private capital is what most families are doing. You know, that's the objective. And maintaining it and adding to it with a boat in the camper van or whatever, you know, I mean, just that whole syndrome. Very involved with the unions quite a lot. Yeah, so that's what
What the 2000s look like.
Maybe the
That's
one
okay.
that
Yeah, just-
what it looks like for me. It's probably I don't know. I wonder whether we're in a pre-revolutionary period of Russia in the 1870s. The feeling of, because there's a lot of
Yeah.
resistance out there, but that's subconscious and it's not overt yet and not organised, and the way that little terrorist acts resonate, that shooting that little fella in the States.
Oh, yeah.
Oh yeah, and so yeah, it feels, and that was what was happening in Russia in that period, or Europe, really. So I don't know. I mean, that's enough for me.
Okay. And Caroline, what about you?
Well, I've been involved in all that.
You have.
I'll give you one
Yeah.
successful Kafka campaign from the mid-2000s, because we've always worked, we don't work by ourselves, we work through other groups, and with other groups, and have done for decades up until now. And the successful mid-2000s campaign was Keep Our Port Public. And Gary Moore, the Progressive Mayor of Christchurch, tried to pull an overnight Swifty and sell the Littleton Port Company.
Yes.
And so we set up a bloody coalition against it, and didn't stop it. What actually stopped it was the Port of Otago then came along and bought enough shares to stop it doing it, but raised up opposition to it, and that led to our involvement in the whole issue of local publicly owned assets. That started the next decade. I'm the convener of Keep Our Assets Canterbury, and that's flowed on to now, and will flow on to this year's election, local body election campaign. And will flow on to next year's general election campaign, with the Prime Minister has said asset sales are back on the agenda.
I think it's kind of interesting that we seem to be gearing up to fight the same battles again.
They come round.
They come round, they do, but this decade feels that
I
way.
just
Caroline
want to add
should
to
talk
that.
about
I just
that
want to
later.
add to that.
Yeah.
Because that's exactly it. But some of the gains that we
Yeah.
made, now I'm talking as a midwife here,
Yeah.
the massive gains that we made, that midwives made in the late 1980s, throughout the 2000s, just been eroded, and that fight is 25 years old now. No, yes, no, 98. It's more than, it's 20.
Yeah.
It's 27 years since we began to have to struggle to retain what we've gained, and it's just steadily eroded until the whole profession is now at the point of collapse, and it's very, very likely that in the next years we're going to be right back to where we were in the 70s and early 80s, where doctors and nurses are controlling birth and women's pregnancies. That's appalling.
That whole,
In a health
That's
system that
absolutely
doesn't have the resources
The
to
health system
manage it
doesn't-
anyway.
No, that's right.
that whole
Because of the erosion of conditions and of money. A midwife burns, the average midwife from the time she graduates to the time she leaves the profession because she's absolutely exhausted and can't go on anymore is now 5.5 years.
Wow.
the union movement has never regained what they had. I mean, when I started, it was compulsory unionism. The employer collected your union fees, all that sort of stuff. That's all gone, and there were national awards. I mentioned that to young workers today. They have no idea what you're talking about.
So, do you think that these 2 decades, say, so the 20 years, there does seem to have been a fight over the same things again and again, and the slow realisation that you're the frog being boiled, in trying to kind of gain that momentum and fight back against a whole range of diverse issues in a constant way that wore people out.
It's a climate movement.
Yeah, and the climate movement rose, absolutely.
Which is a
Yeah.
beacon of hope.
Yeah.
It's a beacon of hope.
So I'm going to pose something slightly different about that. I think there's an amazing amount of work being done in small pockets in the climate movement, and internationally there is this overarching kind of understanding and growth. But here, it seems to me that there's the NGO end, the Greenpeace end. There's lots and lots of little groups, but it doesn't feel like a movement. And Chris, what your view of that is?
Okay.
Mm.
I want to poke on fast. I'm almost tempted to pause the recording when I'm asking this or talking about it, because it feels very personal. But the shape I'm getting around what feels like a gap in the discussion with 2000s, at least from you folk and the discussions we've had throughout the day, feels like, in fairness, we kind of said this, it feels like a burnout of some sort around the year 2000, where everyone did their best to keep moving forwards, but nevertheless it was almost like a brick wall. Not quite a brick wall, but something hit.
I think that's a fair analysis from my perspective. I went through the 2000s, as I said, with the group expulsion from Corso, which was difficult. We formed a new organisation, Action for, what was the ring? Action Research Education Network of Aotearoa, which was a national organisation, and I became its coordinator. And I did that through to 2007, but it was on very few resources. But there's no momentum, and I didn't ever find a place to belong. I work well in a group, I like groups, but you need to have that sense of forward momentum. You know what you're doing, you can talk about things together and make a plan, and that has stopped existing.
From 2010 to 2020, indeed up to here, I've been more active than I have since probably the 70s. We've had the biggest ever campaign against free trade, which was the TPPA, which was tens of thousands of people on the street, tens of thousands.
That wasn't a campaign. I'm going to argue with this about that.
Right.
That was a lovely protest where people knew almost fuck all about the issues and took it nowhere. These are the things that are tricky.
Okay. There was the massive. I put out a 2-word press release the other day that you told me was a bit too cryptic for people.
Yeah, I thought it was.
The 2 words were kin.com, the shortest press release I've ever put out in my life. And that all arose from the events that led to the GCSB bill protests, which once again were tens of thousands of people in the streets that went through. But there was a whole awareness created mainly through John Campbell, when he was on TV3, about intelligence agencies. And the other thing that I've been most active in these 10, 15 years has been Keep Our Assets. And that have been successful campaigns.
Yeah.
The Christchurch City Council, under the pressure of the central government, tried to sell hundreds of millions of dollars of publicly owned assets, starting with the low-hanging fruit, the guys leaning on shovels. You know, those lazy bastards leaning on shovels, let's fucking sell them off. City care. So we stopped that. We got that beaten. And then they tried another one in 2022 with an overnight move to try to give the holding company that holds $5 billion worth of publicly owned assets in Christchurch, the port, the airport, all that sort of stuff, flog it off. And once again, at 24 hours notice, with our old mate Nathaniel playing a leading role, that was defeated. And
To Caroline's point about we seem like we're fighting the same
we are.
battles again and again and
That's
again.
right, because they don't go away.
Chris,
Well, it's
These-
not just that they don't go away, it's that we've lost
yes.
so much.
Right.
What we had has been eroded.
Oh, that's right. Well, the battle
Little
that
by
we're
little,
fighting,
by
that
little
one,
by little.
and that one we're fighting to keep public ownership
Yeah.
and succeeding. thus far. Some of it's gone, but other cities, Auckland, Wellington, for example, gone.
I think what was I mean, I'm not sure that I would consider burnout, because I was doing some campaigning work through an organisation I worked for, but I think the times are changing and lots of, I don't think we did the hard work of analysis of getting the right strategies always in that early period, because New Zealand, the nature of New Zealand changed because we had massive immigration as well. Not that I'm against immigration, but it's Peter Thiel and people like that. I can't remember what year he got to be a citizen, but some of that sort of stuff. But the government, we didn't keep up, and it became more technical, and they were able to brush people off more easily again. And as Paul said, you couldn't do a protest and it didn't seem to have any impact at all. They got quite good at brushing those off.
And we certainly worked hard, I think, in that 2000 to 2010. I don't think it was less
Because we
work
wrote
in
stuff,
some ways, but I agree that we had lost
we wrote stuff
momentum.
about trade
Yeah.
and things, and international stuff. Maybe that was some of it. And at the same time, I think Maori were getting the settlements were beginning, and people were starting to do some stuff with it that meant they were a stronger voice, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. But I always want to say we lost our way, but I think it was because we were diverted from the analytical task and the dialogue with the communities and engaging by a whole variety of things.
And I would have to say dialogue changed in that time, didn't it? Because as we moved more online, that we did less of the work that we used to do, which was going everywhere and talking to everyone. Debt became a major acceptable thing on a personal level, and so accumulation and commodification became bigger because debt was acceptable. And decades before that, debt wasn't so acceptable. But I do think the work was still happening for a long time. In my own world, I would say it's way less in the 2010 to 2020 than it was in the decade before. But I really agree with Gillian that and now the foot off the pedal of analysis was very strong. And I keep wondering, and there may be no foundation to this thought at all, but I wonder whether war does something to the New Zealand activist left scene, that the focus turns directly to it, like it did for Iraq and Afghanistan, and that everything else is kind of lost in the process. I wonder that a bit about Gaza as well, and that it absolutely brings people together in an amazing way, as it did in 2001, 2002, and is certainly doing now. But everything else falls away. And I don't know whether that's really true, but it kind of, I wonder about
the
it.
Gaza movement is, people are hungry for the old information.
I do wonder, and as I say, I'm just wondering, whether the building climate movement got cut off a bit at the knees by Gaza. Is that a fair thing, Chris, or not?
And no. This was the other thing I was going to come back to. Not really.
Not really.
At least not as I see it. I only have experience with Restore Passenger Rail and Climate Liberation Outer Rail. If we can allow me and them some ego and say we were at least a significant part of the building climate movement, what stopped us was national. It was that election year or two back where we had been going strong on rail for a long time and were thinking that we were going to win it soon. And then we had the election and we had national come in, and all of a sudden all of that momentum and that revolutionary spirit, that thing of we can fucking do this and we are going to keep blocking roads until we can, falls through.
Why?
Okay.
Because we can't do that. Two reasons, really. One, we can't do that under national. there is no way to convince the national government
No.
to restore passenger rail.
Mm.
And two, we got, and I don't necessarily think this would have been as much of a problem without the national thing, but we got beat by the cops because in Restore Passenger Rail, your first action you were going to be fine. Afterwards, your second action was starting to get risky, and if you did your third action, you would go home either with an ankle bracelet or having to report to your local police station, sometimes as often as once a day.
Mm.
And those two factors combined scuppered us. And since then, we have not really Restore Passenger Rail became Climate Liberation Aotearoa, and we ended up losing most of our best, brightest, and most motivated people to other causes, and aren't that sort of powerful group anymore.